in which we will be dealing with the lessons of the Holocaust. I am Frank Eakin of the Department of Religion. In this session we have three very distinguished panelists who will work in calling out some of the lessons of the Holocaust. What I have asked them to do is for each of them to speak for approximately 15 minutes out of the area of his or her own expertise, and then we will take the questions from the floor that you might have or the comments. I am going to do one thing just slightly differently. I'm going to ask you, if you will, to keep your questions as crisp as you can, because I would like to repeat those questions before the panelist tries to respond. Sitting back a little bit, I had trouble with some of the questions earlier, getting the full drift of the question, not being able to hear it, to understand it. So I will try to repeat the question before the panelist actually addresses the question. Now may I, without further delay, introduce to you our three panelists. Sitting immediately to my left is Eva Fleischner. Dr. Fleischner is a Roman Catholic theologian who is professor of religion at Montclair State College in Montclair, New Jersey. Her training is from Radcliffe, her baccalaureate degree. She has a Master of Arts from the University of Notre Dame, and her doctorate in religious studies from Marquette. She has both demonstrated her acumen as a scholar, as witnessed by publication and by the esteem of others. She was awarded a Fulbright scholarship where she worked at the University of Paris one year. She is also the author of a book which is an excellent study, I can vouch for that, The View of Judaism in German Christian Theology Since 1945, an extraordinarily important subject. She is also the editor of a book entitled Auschwitz, The Beginning of a New Era. That was published in 1977. She is currently engaged in research on Catholic rescuers of Jews in France during the Holocaust. And for this, she has received a grant from the International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. This promises to bring forth another book of singular importance for us. I should also mention that she is a member of the advisory board of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Secretariat for Catholic-Jewish Relations. Again, an area of crucial importance for the relationship of Jews and Christians. Our second panelist, in alphabetic order, not in seated order, on the far side, is Ira Gissen. Ira is the director of the North Carolina-Virginia region of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. He's a recognized authority in the field of human rights, has testified before committees of the United States Congress and for agencies such as the Federal Reserve Board. A world traveler, he has studied human rights and minority groups in Israel, Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean, Hawaii, the Soviet Union, Japan, and China. Under 3 presidents, he has served our nation in positions of singular responsibility, where he helped create new programs of equal opportunity. For 8 years prior to that, he worked with the American Jewish Committee in the Midwest and in New York. He holds a master's degree from the Center for Human Relations Studies at New York University, where he also studied for his doctorate. He has done further graduate study at Northwestern and Rutgers universities. He has served as national chairman of the Professional Staff Association of the Anti-Defamation League and was an elected trustee and president of the Board of Education in Teaneck, New Jersey. He was a member of the Long Range Planning Committee of the Union of the American Hebrew Congregations and has been a national vice president of the Association of Jewish Community Relations Workers and chairman of their Committee on Professional Standards. Maybe more than any of that, he is a very warm and congenial colleague here in the city. And then, seated among the bookends there, is Melvin Urofsky. Mel is currently professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University here in the city. He was former chair of that department. Prior to coming to Virginia Commonwealth in 1974, he taught at the Ohio State University and at the State University of New York at Albany. He has also lectured at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and at Tel Aviv University. He obtained both his undergraduate and his doctorate from Columbia, but he is either a slow learner or a continual worker. In 1983, Mel received his Juris Doctor from the University of Virginia. He is the author, and I think this says he is not a slow learner, he is the author or editor of 19 books and over 100 articles. He has written on American Jewish history and more recently on American constitutional development, which you can see his legal side taking its place there. His major works in the American Jewish history include such things as American Zionism from Herzl to the Holocaust, and We Are One, which is a biography of Rabbi Stephen S. Wise. He is a co-editor of a multi-volume enterprise on the letters of Louis Brandeis. He has also done individual publication on Brandeis in the form of 2 separate works. He has recently published 2 additional books, one dealing with Justice William O. Douglas, the papers of Justice Douglas, and a textbook entitled A March of Liberty, American Constitutional and Legal Development has recently been published and will be followed very shortly by a study dealing with cases and materials, which he has edited. He's at work on several additional projects at this point. We won't go into those. We'll make him validate those before we say anything about them. We have a distinguished group before you, and I will ask them to come forward now in alphabetical order. It's an interesting mix in that we have a theologian and then a person who comes out of the community orientation and then a historian, and each to address the issue of lessons of the Holocaust.
I find it difficult to speak after the extraordinary panel we had earlier this afternoon. I think to say anything after that is difficult. At the same time, I feel very grateful and privileged to have been present at it. It's good to see some students here. I remind me of my students back home. I'm going to speak of 5 lessons of the Holocaust. In 1968, I think it was, I attended an international symposium on the Holocaust that was held at York University in Canada. In one of our discussions, Emil Fackenheim, seated across the table from me, said, I quote, "If I had been a Jew in Hitler's Germany, I do not know which side I would have been on." I have never forgotten his words. Few of us, I think, have the courage and the honesty of Emil Fackenheim, namely, to admit the possibility that, had it not been for historical circumstances, accidents of birth, etc., we might have been among the perpetrators. Terrible as it is to imagine oneself having been among the victims, I think in one sense it is more terrible, more difficult to imagine oneself among the perpetrators. And yet, we need to try and do this. And it is very difficult. I see this among my students. How invariably and instinctively, I think, at the beginning of our course, I teach the Holocaust periodically at Montclair State, at the beginning of our course, They speak in terms of we, they. We, the good ones, of course. They, the evil ones, the Nazis or the Germans even. One of my main goals always in this course is to try and transform this we-they dichotomy into we. The Holocaust reveals not the evil in some people who were monsters, or in a certain national group, the Germans, or in a political group, the Nazis, but rather the abyss in all of us, the potential for darkness in the human spirit. That is the first lesson that I would mention. I will mention a second lesson only briefly, because Dr. Maurer spoke of it so eloquently last night, namely, the terrible danger of indifference. Many of us, I'm sure, remember the figure of the bystander painted so vividly by Elie Wiesel in The Town Beyond the Wall. That face at the window that looks on impassively as Jewish women and children are rounded up in the town square. The power of indifference, which, as Dr. Maurer said last night, enables the demonic to do its work, without which the demonic perhaps could not do its work. One of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what is that fine line between indifference and active involvement? At what point does the bystander become the criminal? A third lesson, I'm mentioning these only briefly, hope we can come back to some of these points in the discussion. The churches. Dr. Maris commented last night that, rather surprisingly, no one had mentioned the question of the churches, and it was surprising, I think. It must be mentioned among the lessons of the Holocaust, and it is a lesson that needs to be learned particularly by Christians, namely, the fact that Christianity helped make the Holocaust possible by the anti-Jewish teachings that have been part of the Christian tradition almost from the beginning. I refer here to what has come to be known as the teaching of contempt, a term coined by the French historian Jules Isaac, most of whose family perished in Auschwitz. This teaching helped prepare the soil for the Holocaust. It is a very painful thing for Christians to have to confront the shadow in their own tradition, to have to face the fact that their own, I should say our own scriptures, have fueled prejudice and hatred rather than love. But we must confront this. And there is evidence that the churches are doing this, particularly the Roman Catholic Church since Vatican II. A third lesson that we must learn is that the individual can make a difference, even in a ruthless dictatorship, such as was Nazi Germany and Europe, and certainly in our own democratic states. Let me give you one example of this. In his latest book, Approaches to Auschwitz, which he co-authored with John Roth, a Catholic theologian, Richard Rubinstein speaks of Gitta Sereni's book, Into That Darkness. In this book, Sereni retells the life of Franz Stangl, who had been commandant at Treblinka. Sereni interviewed him for many hours. She also interviewed Stangl's wife, Teresa, in many conversations. And at the end of these conversations, Sereni asked Teresa Stangl, I quote, "Would you tell me, what do you think would have happened if at any time you had faced your husband with an absolute choice, if you had said to him, either you get out of this terrible thing or else the children and I will leave you. What I should like to know is, which do you think he would have chosen? Theresa Stangl was silent for a long time. And then she said that, I quote, "In the last analysis, I believe he would have chosen me." This points to a lesson that is so relevant, I think, for each and every one of us. Namely, if more individuals had called each other to account, the course of history would have been altered. As Rubinstein says in commenting on this, we are and must be responsible for each other as well as for ourselves. We must be born again as men and women blessed with the capacity to confront and care for each other here and now. The courage to care. I come here to one more lesson, the last that I will mention for now. And this lesson, I think, requires that we unlearn another lesson of the Holocaust, namely, that there were some who cared, that the Jews were not, after all, completely alone. It is difficult to remember this. It took me a very long time to be aware of it, really aware of it. Why is it difficult? Because the darkness of the Holocaust is so great that it appears almost impenetrable to light. And yet, light there was, as is expressed so beautifully in the title of Nechama Tech's recent book, When Light Pierced the Darkness. The light radiating from the lives and actions of those non-Jews who did not stand by, who did not cooperate, but instead who saved Jews, or who tried. Those whom Jewish tradition honors with the title Righteous Among the Nations, Hasidei Umot Haolam. We must know about them, we must remember them, not only for the sake of justice, because they deserved it, but also for our sakes, in order to keep alive in ourselves, or to salvage, or to revivify, if we have lost it, our faith in human goodness, our faith in humanity. Pierre Sauvage, who as a little baby was hidden in that remarkable little village in the French Alps, Chambon-sur-Lignon, that little village which became a city of refuge for Jews during the war, where I believe 5,000 Jews were saved. And the Pierre Sauvage, who was there as a little baby and survived, came to the United States. Many years later, went back to Le Chambon and made a film, which has just recently been released. It is called Weapons of the Spirit. The film is about the people in Le Chambon and why they did what they did. And he says, I quote, "If Jews do not learn that the whole world did not stand by idly while we were slaughtered, we will undermine our ability to develop the friendships that we so badly need. If Jews do not know this, do not learn this, they will be unable to trust." And Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who has done so much in this area, speaks of the danger facing the Jewish community, that they will wall themselves off, believing that no one else cares, and that would be a tragedy for them and for the rest of the world. So it is very, very important for Jews to know that there were some who cared, and it is also important for Christians to know that some among them cared, so that they will have models to follow, so that they will recognize and be inspired by the potential for good in their own tradition. And most important, I think, so that they will do all in their power to educate their children, their young people, in such a way that they will recognize in the hunted and oppressed, whatever their creed, color, or race, their neighbor, their own flesh and blood, and will consequently reach out to the downtrodden and oppressed of the earth, whoever they may be, and wherever they may cross their path. Thank you.
I would like to precede my remarks by expressing my concurrence in what Dr. Eakin said about Dr. Gabara, whom I first met in the very early stages of planning for this conference. And I must say, based upon that meeting and subsequent contacts, as well as this conference itself, it has become evident to me, as I'm sure it has to all of you, that she is not only a great asset to this university, but to the greater Richmond community. We are most fortunate to have her with us. In preparing what I thought was a reasonably good paper for presentation at this session, I was startled to find a bit of news a couple of weeks ago, after I had finished working on my paper, that I found so deplorable and yet so important. I knew I had to include it in my remarks, and yet I was at a loss for words on how to do so. And reading about this news, I came across an item that I thought described and analyzed it rather well. And I want to share this with you as a prefatory statement to my presentation. I'm going to read a few sentences that appeared in an editorial in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. And I quote, "Austria's parliament decided the other day to offer further compensation to victims of Nazi rule following Austria's annexation by Hitler in 1938. The one-time payments range from $208 to $416 per person, depending on particulars. Austria years ago offered modest pensions to some individuals who had suffered during Nazi rule, but it rejected large-scale reparations. The official version had it that Austria was Hitler's first victim, coerced into union with the Nazi Reich. This ignores the ecstatic welcome for Hitler and the surge in Nazi party membership following Anschluss. If Austrians truly believe that they were only victims, no reparations are required. If they finally are coming to terms with a painful past, then reparations payments of $416 are macabre. And until Mr. Waldheim admitted that, yes, there were things he hadn't talked about before, Austrians were, by and large, content to follow his example. Call it Waldheim's disease. The cure lies not in token payments, but remembrance. The first lesson, that there are still lessons to be learned. A Roman Catholic expert on the subject of anti-Semitism posed the question, when will Jews forget about the Holocaust? And he answered that question, when will Jews forget about the Holocaust? With the answer, when Christians remember. But I say to you that to remember is not enough. To memorialize the martyrs of the Holocaust is essential, but it is insufficient. If the death of 6 million is to have any meaning, we must learn how this horror was possible. And from that knowledge, we must dedicate ourselves to work to prevent a recurrence from ever happening again on the face of this earth. There are those who would deny the existence of the Holocaust. They are in the lunatic fringe of anti-Semites. There are those who would trivialize the Holocaust. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I was conducting a program somewhat similar to this with a friend of mine who survived Auschwitz. And during the question and answer period, a woman in the audience raised her hand and said to my friend, the Auschwitz survivor, "I can understand what you went through. My brother was in the Army Air Corps, and he was shot down and captured by the Germans and interred in a prison of war camp." My friend, the Auschwitz survivor, said to her, "My dear lady, compared to Auschwitz, a prisoner of war camp was the Hilton." And there are those, and I think these people are the most dangerous of all, who would universalize the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a uniquely Jewish tragedy of unprecedented proportions in the history of humankind. It is true that not everyone in the Holocaust was Jewish, but all Jews were victims of the Holocaust. 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe died in the Holocaust. 1/3 of all the Jews in the world expired in the Holocaust. We ask ourselves, what do we say to our children? And we answer, remember. We tell our children they dare not forget the death of 6 million innocents, but more than remember, try to understand. In the history of our people, we have known enslavement, persecution, oppression, torture, expulsion. From Pharaoh to Nebuchadnezzar, to Titus, to Haman, the English expulsion, the Crusaders on their way to the Holy Land stopped to kill Jews along the way. The Spanish Inquisition offered Jews the alternative, convert or die. Tsarist pogroms devastated the Jewish shtetls in Eastern Europe, but never, never in the thousands and thousands of years of history of our people had we ever before faced mass extermination. Hitler was unprecedented in our experience, but Hitler alone could not have killed 6 million, nor could Heinrich Himmler and the SS, who were far too few in number. They could not have operated that death machine by themselves. How did they do it? They began by conducting a massive propaganda campaign, beginning with the Nuremberg laws and climaxing in Kristallnacht, when 250 synagogues were burned. It was a campaign directed toward the dehumanization of Jews in the eyes of their Christian neighbors. As a result, the overwhelming majority of the German Christian population decided to see nothing, to hear nothing, and to say nothing. My friends, if the Holocaust has taught us anything, it has taught us that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. Germany would not have started the killing if the rest of the world had cared. Before World War II broke out, the Western democracies, the United States, Canada, England, France, and many other countries, convened in Evian, France, to discuss how they might help save the Jewish refugees who sought to escape the growing storm in Germany. And only one country among all the Western democracies said that it would admit Jewish refugees above and beyond the number stipulated in their national origin quota system, the Dominican Republic. Consider the signals sent by the United States to the Third Reich. Consider the odyssey of the steamship St. Louis, turned away from the United States. It had to sail back to Europe, rejected by Cuba, carrying its human cargo. Consider the fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt refused to sponsor refugee legislation in the United States. Why? Because he feared the opposition of labor unions, since our nation was in the midst of a Great Depression, and refugees, he was told, might compete for jobs. And then legislation was proposed, let's just save the Jewish children who would not compete for jobs. And that legislation went nowhere. Only one congressman stood up in the House of Representatives and pleaded to save the Jews, the late, great Congressman Kane of New Jersey. And the rest of Congress ignored him. As a result, the so-called final solution to the Jewish problem was decided upon by the Nazis in 1941, before America entered the war. Mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, began systematic mass murder of Jews in the Soviet Union and the Baltic states, which the Germans had invaded. In the single month of August 1942 alone, over 400,000 Jews were slaughtered in German-occupied Europe. But the Nazis had more than merely indifferent civilian populations helping them. In Vichy, France, Marshal Pétain, on his own initiative, ordered the registration of all Jews to help the German overlords expedite their removal from France. In the Baltic states, before the first German soldier crossed the border, civilians murdered rabbis and hunted down and rounded up their Jews in eager anticipation of the wishes of their new masters. There were exceptions. A parish priest in Poland was brought a Jewish child by a Catholic couple to whom that child had been given for safekeeping. They asked the priest to baptize the Jewish child, and the priest said to those Catholic parents, "What are the wishes of his true parents?" They told him, and he refused to baptize the child. You all know that priest today. He is Pope John Paul II. 2,000 Roman Catholic priests died in the Holocaust because of their opposition to Hitler, to the Third Reich, and for their efforts to save Jews from the Holocaust. In one town in Poland, one example among several, 23 Roman Catholic men, women, and children who had hidden Jews from the Nazis were herded into a barn, the doors were locked, and they were burned alive. Jews fought back. There was a revolt at Treblinka, there was a mass escape from Sobibor, and the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto is memorialized to this day in Yom HaShoah. Roving bands of Jewish partisans at Vilna and elsewhere, with the few rifles they could collect, harassed and attacked the Wehrmacht. After the war, a French Jewish scholar, Jules Isaac, met with Pope John XXIII, and he documented and discussed with the Holy Father how the teaching of contempt had made possible the slaughter of 6 million. Pope John convened Vatican II, which he unfortunately did not live to see, and Vatican II produced Nostra Aetate, which for the first time in the almost 2,000-year history of the Church repudiated the myth of deicide. Today, in a very few years, we have come a very long way. Pope John Paul II visited and prayed for the martyrs at Auschwitz, and for the first time in the history of the Church, a pope visited a synagogue, the synagogue in Rome. What can you and I do? Example. Last spring, I saw the culmination of 2 years' work that I had undertaken with the Most Reverend Walter Sullivan, the Bishop of the Diocese of Richmond. On an afternoon in the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart, there was an interfaith worship service in memory of the martyrs of the Holocaust. Participating in that service were 2 Roman Catholic bishops and 4 rabbis, among others. There were over 500 Catholics, Protestants, and Jews in the cathedral, and at the conclusion of the service, Bishop Sullivan led the procession to the lawn outside the cathedral, where he unveiled an 11-foot-high statue dedicated to the memory of the martyrs of the Holocaust, a statue inspired by Jeremiah, Rachel weeping for her children. And on the pedestal, on that statue, on which the statue was mounted, appeared one word in Hebrew and English, Zachor, remember. The son of that congressman, Congressman Keene, who spoke out so futilely in the United States Congress, is Governor Keene of New Jersey. And under his administration, New Jersey became the first state to adopt a public school curriculum guide on the Holocaust. Last spring, in a statewide television broadcast, the Commonwealth of Virginia announced the adoption of a statewide curriculum guide on the Holocaust. There is much that we can do to teach ourselves, to teach our friends, to teach our children. The way is clear. Some of you, I know, for perfectly understandable reasons, have hatred burned in your heart, burned there by the crematoria. But I would say to you, bear in mind the words of Chaim Herzog, the president of Israel, who in his visit to West Germany went to the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen, which he helped liberate during World War II. These are Chaim Herzog's words, and I quote, "I do not bring forgiveness with me, nor forgetfulness. The only ones who can forgive are dead. The living have no right to forgive. The mourning of your deaths will be kept in eternal memory in our hearts, not to sustain an enduring enmity, not to maintain a sterile, debilitating hatred, but to gain strength and steadfastness." Again, what can we teach our children? Teach them the meaning of the following words, the words spoken by a Protestant minister who spent 7 years in the concentration camps. You've heard them before, and I beg you, do not listen to the sounds. Think of the meaning. In Germany, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, nobody was left to speak up. I'd like to conclude with a few lines that were found on the walls of a cellar in Cologne, Germany, where Jews hid from the Nazis. Those words read as follows: I believe in the sun even when it is not shining. I believe in love even when feeling it not. I believe in God even when God is silent.
I am put in the rather unenviable position of following Ira and also of coming after what was a very, from what I understand, a very moving session earlier, which I had to miss because I was teaching today. When Uliana first approached me about this, I was reluctant to participate, and my initial fear probably was correct, because what I have to say certainly cannot match in eloquence or in fervor what you've heard before. One of the problems that has been mentioned at this conference is the difficulty of dealing with the Holocaust in almost any way, shape, or form. Historians dealing with the Holocaust period quickly discover that in addition to the normal problems of historical research and analysis, broader questions underlie the effort to understand why and how the Third Reich set out to systematically destroy the Jewish people. There is the problem of uniqueness, the claim that what happened at Auschwitz is so unparalleled in the human experience that it is impossible to understand, that only those who lived through that ordeal can ever comprehend it, and that efforts to apply normal modes of scholarly inquiry trivialize this most awesome and terrible event. In response, scholars who are not survivors of the death camps, who may in fact have been born after 1945, say that nothing in the past is so exceptional that it cannot be examined. While admitting that the Holocaust is different in both scope and nature from other incidents of genocide, they note, and I think make a very telling point, that if only survivors may talk or write about their experiences, then who will remember after the last of the survivors is gone? Closely allied to the issue of uniqueness is the question of moral commitment, which is frequently posed as in opposition to scholarly objectivity. Let me illustrate what I mean with a personal story. Several years ago, I appeared on a panel dealing with the American response to the Holocaust. Henry Feingold of the City University of New York, and to the best of my knowledge, the first person ever to teach a course on the Holocaust in the United States, gave a paper on the American government's response. In it, he detailed some of the things which Ira mentioned earlier, but then he went on to make the argument that perhaps it is unrealistic to expect governments, especially modern nation states, to behave in a moral manner. He also laid out some of the problems with which the American government, and especially the Roosevelt administration, had to deal with in the 1930s and 40s. My paper examined American Zionist policy during the war. Both of us, without mitigating the evil of what had happened, of what the Nazis had done, and the failure of the Western democracies to act, pointed out that there were restraints operating on the Western governments, on the American governments, and on the American Jewish community. We tried to ask the same type of question, to utilize the same type of analysis which we would have applied to any other interest group trying to affect government policy. We didn't say that the Holocaust was not different. What we said was that instead of looking back from what we know now, to try to understand what was known at the time and what constraints operated. Then Saul Friedman, who has written a book on the American response and was supposed to comment on our papers, rushed to the microphone, clutching a copy of the 1945 Life magazine, which had those first horrifying pictures of the liberation of the death camps, and began berating us. His argument, in essence, was that our papers were irrelevant. It did not matter, even if we were right in what we had said. Just look at these pictures. The United States and the American Jews did not do enough. It did not matter whether those efforts could or could not have succeeded. They should have tried. Their failure to try was the real sin. We didn't know what we were talking about. This incident took place about 10 years ago. But the debate has been going on for nearly 25 years, ever since Arthur Morse first published his book, While 6 Million Died. That of the American government and American Jews stood by indifferently while Hitler set about implementing the final solution. Since then, there has been a steady stream of books and articles on the subject, and there seems to be no end in sight. I just finished reading a manuscript of still another book trying to understand what had happened. I do not intend to list all these works. At this point, the bibliography on the Holocaust is very extensive. But I want to point out two books in particular because to some extent they point out the debate that is going on and also point to some lessons that we have to try to keep in mind. The first is the 1984 prize-winning account by David Wyman called The Abandonment of the Jews, in which the author marshals a great deal of historical evidence to buttress his charges. The American government, the American people, and American Jewish leadership failed to respond to the greatest moral challenge of the century. And by failing to respond, he charges, became accomplices in the final solution. The son and grandson of Protestant ministers, Wyman infuses his work with a relentless moral tone, holding up each event, each policy, each actor to an extremely high standard of behavior. As one reviewer wrote, Wyman, quote, believes that Christian love should govern the behavior of nations and that there is an obligation for a Christian witness to suffering. Although Wyman's book received wide praise, there were some dissenting voices, and one in particular deserves our attention. Lucy Davidovich, the author of the highly acclaimed The War Against the Jews, and a person who certainly cannot be accused of moral indifference, wrote a controversial review article of the Wyman book entitled, Could the United States Have Rescued European Jews from Hitler? In it, she relentlessly separated the what ought to have beens from the factual conditions of the times, and concluded that while it is nice when governments act in a moral manner, in the end, quote, in war and in politics, it is only power that counts, unquote. The American Jewish community did not have the clout to force the Roosevelt administration to do the politically unpopular, and the American government did not have the power to stop an irrational Nazi hierarchy from pursuing its murderous vision. Now, the debate is far more than a question of scholarly interpretation of the past. The American Jewish community has been racked with guilt for nearly half a century over the failure to rescue its European brethren. Its alleged moral obtuseness, and now, according to Wyman, its actual complicity in the final solution itself. Hardly any American Jews of the wartime generation, the vast majority of whom were immigrants or the children of immigrants, did not suffer the loss of some family in the Holocaust. And these charges are the salt in the wounds of grievous personal loss. Let me tell you another, more painful story, at least for me personally. It is difficult for Jewish scholars to deal with the Holocaust in a manner that somehow meets both the moral commands that Emil Fackenheim has set upon us and the objective standards of our discipline. There is an inherent contradiction, to some extent, in trying to be objective in the face of enormous evil. Yet somehow or other, there is the necessity to try to understand, and merely getting up there and either crying mea culpa or pointing a finger of guilt does not add to the understanding. In the course that I and Professor Joseph Bendersky teach on the Holocaust, we have a same initial response, a we, they. Although we do not have this intention in the course to turn everything into a we. What we do try to do is try to get the students to understand not what happened, because to some extent that's beyond comprehension, but to try to get, because they all start out saying, how could something this horrible, this evil happen, and everybody just stood by? The answer is not everybody just stood by. The American Jewish community, for all the charges against it, that it failed to lobby the president, that it failed to lobby the Congress, that it failed to try to rescue, that it failed to mount public protests, that it failed to do this and that, did in fact do everything that it was accused of not doing. I once had the opportunity to talk with Elie Wiesel after he had published an article accusing the American Jewish leadership of cowardice in the war and saying, how could they stand by? This was after Stephen Wise had first learned the news from Gerhard Riegner and had agreed to a State Department request not to publish it until it could be confirmed. How could Wise stand by, Wiesel asked. Why didn't he rush down to Washington? Why didn't they have a mass protest meeting? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? And I asked him afterwards, did he think it would have made any difference? He said he doesn't know. I said, do you think that the Jews of the 1930s even knew about such protest tactics? Aren't you reading back the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 50s and 60s and the anti-war movement of the 60s and 70s, and laying a burden upon the American Jewish community for its failure to do something at a time when A, it was incapable of doing this, and B, when the American Jewish community itself was fearful? Those of us who have been born after 1939, as I was, or after the war, need to remember that anti-Semitism was not absent from this country in the 1930s, that groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Silver Shirts, Father Coughlin, William Dudley White, and others preached an anti-Semitism as vicious as the Nazis and had a wide audience. To say that Congress was indifferent is only part of the story. One of the lessons that we have to learn is not just what happened at Auschwitz, but what happened in the rest of the world, why they acted as they did. This is not to excuse the American Jewish community because it failed to rescue Jewry, because it failed to do as much as some wanted it to do. In the face of something like the Holocaust, there was always an opportunity to do more. There was always an opportunity for individuals, and indeed there were many individuals, not just in the United States, but as we've heard in Europe, who acted heroically, some at the cost of their lives. We also need to understand, and this may be the hardest part, we know what happened. We have the statistics. We've seen the pictures. We've heard the survivors' testimony. A number of years ago, when I was working on a book, and I was younger and a little more cocky and self-confident that, there were rights and wrongs on this, I had the opportunity to interview a number of Jewish leaders of the wartime period, most of whom are dead now. People like Emanuel Newman, who was Abba Hillel Silver's right-hand man in the Zionist movement, Rabbi Israel Goldstein, Golda Meir, others. And I asked them, why were you, how did you respond? I mean, here are these charges that you did nothing. And I can remember Israel Goldstein, with tears practically rolling down his face, said, look, I can tell you now that I know what happened, and I can tell you that even when I was told then, we did not believe it happened. We couldn't believe that it happened. It made no sense to us. John Karski, who was the delegate of the Polish government in exile, was sent west to tell the democracies what was going on in Eastern Europe. At a conference in Washington a few years back, I heard Karski tell this story, which he repeats in his book and which some of you may be familiar with. He met with Justice Felix Frankfurter and told Frankfurter what was going on, what he knew about Auschwitz, what he knew about the killings, the mass shootings. And he said at the end, Frankfurter got up white-faced and said, I do not believe you. I do not say that you are lying, but I do not believe you. I cannot believe you. My mind and my heart are not made in a way that I can believe you. One has to recall that up until the 1930s, Germany had probably a better record of toleration for Jews than almost any country in Central and Western Europe. If one was looking for anti-Semitism in Europe, one looked in Poland, one looked in France, but not in Germany. We have to remember that the generation of Jewish leadership at this time is not the generation of today. It is not a generation that knew of the Holocaust, that knew afterwards what had happened. It is not a generation which has enjoyed enormous political influence because of many changes in American society. It is not a generation that knew the tactics of the civil rights and anti-war movement. The lessons that, as historians, we try to learn is not to forgive, not to forget. Above all, not to forget, but also to try to understand why, so that it doesn't happen again.
We are ready to entertain your questions with appreciation to our three panelists for excellent presentations. Is there a question or comment? Yes, ma'am.
I don't understand. Why do we talk about Christian love or somebody doing something extraordinary? He's a good Christian. Why isn't it he's a good human being or he's a person that is loving? But we always make the difference. He's a good Christian and he's a good human being. Why?
Okay, could everyone hear the question? I think that one was expressed, thank you, loudly enough that we can hear. Do you have a particular person that you would like to address?
I heard a Christian love again.
Oh.
What is the difference? It happens to be a good human being that happens to be Jewish or happens to be Christian. Why do we make the difference?
Maybe as the Christian representative on our panel, I will throw you to the wolves.
Yeah, it's a good question. And we do just that a lot of the time. Perhaps in part because much of the West is Christian by tradition or has claimed to be, and because Christians, and I'm not sure that ultimately this redounds to our honor, speak a great deal of love. And sometimes, I think, claim to have a monopoly on love, on the love of God and of the love for God, forgetting, I think, often that that message of love, of neighbor, has come to them from Judaism. It is the Jewish scriptures and not the Christian scriptures who invented that. And when Jesus quotes this, says this, he's quoting the Hebrew scriptures. And so perhaps in part it is because of the Christian claim. And if I understood you correctly, using this term in connection with David Wyman, since David Wyman himself comes out of the Christian tradition, I think for him it is natural to use that term. Now, whether it is natural for the rest of the world to use that term, I'm not sure. Some of you have something to say to this.
Anybody else wish to address that? Yes, sir.
In my work, I act as a counselor oftentimes. A year or so ago, someone, as you know, counselors let people cathartic and white run down and so on, and it's running down. He said, a person who was with me said, and thank heavens that I got good strength from Christianity, Jesus, whatever. And I didn't want to say anything that would polarize. I think so often it's Jews and Christians, and I don't like it for the same reason. I think it's human being stuff. And I said to him at that time, you wouldn't say that if you were in India. tear-jerking article about one of the Hiroshima maidens that Norman Cousins had brought over to the hospital. She had a bonnet on, etc. And finally this cab driver fell in love with her, etc. And the post-interviewer said, "How did you feel about the fact that it was the Americans did this to you?" She said, it was war. And she was a Hindu. And I let it go at that. So sometimes I think it is good to think of the fact that there are others in addition to Christians and Jews. There aren't just two, if I may.
Yes, sir.
The horrors of the Holocaust are extremely shocking. The only people who understand suffering are really those who have been living there or witnessed this suffering. The major reason really is the indifference of the world to the waste of human lives. I wish this symposium will send a message for call for peace in Israel, where the United States peace plan is now under negotiation so that we can stop the killing, the mass punishment, blowing of houses, deportation, so that newer generations can live in peace, not in hatred and bitterness.
With that, we would certainly all agree. Other question or comment? Yes, sir.
I have a kind of response to something that maybe each of you touched on. Dr. Fleischner mentioned one lesson of the Holocaust, being that individuals can make a difference, and you mentioned Stangel's wife as a person who maybe could have made a difference. And as an idealist, I find myself wanting that to be one of the lessons of the Holocaust, and wanting to believe that individuals could have made a difference. But as a realist, I don't believe that in a way, and I kind of feel more in line with what Dr. Urofsky or maybe Lucy Dovich said. And I would just like to hear any comments you might have, Dr. Fleischner or Dr. Urofsky, about that distinction between one individual could have made a difference and nations are immoral.
Okay.
Big.
Everyone could hear the question. The issue has to do with whether or not one individual can make a significant difference in the way history works itself out, or does history propel itself along almost indifferent to the individual?
I think one of the things that has helped me to believe in this a little bit more, that the individual can make a difference, has been my work over the last 2.5 years with rescuers in France. It has been a new lease on life for me almost, because I have worked in the area of Holocaust studies since 1968-69, and there are times when I feel unable to go on. It has become so heavy, and this work, which I was asked to do, it was not my own idea, it was Yehuda Bauer's suggestion that I get into this, has been very life-giving for me. And in interviewing, I interviewed 46 rescuers in all in France. And in interviewing these people, I was confronted with the fact that they had acted as they did and that lives had been saved. That for the most part, there were some exceptions, but for the most part, and this comes back to what you were saying about Christian love, the majority had not acted explicitly as Christians, but simply because they were victims and they had to be helped. But I find in these people individuals who, very much like ourselves, ordinary. This morning, speakers mentioned a number of times that so many of the perpetrators had been ordinary people, the little people. Well, so many of the rescuers also were ordinary, were little people. None of them, I think I can say this without qualification, none of them think of themselves as having done anything heroic. We did it because it had to be done. So I'm confronted with this fact. The story of Fritz Standl, which I have just read in Rubenstein's book, I think is very powerful. when his wife says, yes, I believe you would have chosen me, so that I have to think, what would have happened if she had challenged? And what does that mean then for me in 1988, in my life in the United States, for all of us, Middle East? So I do believe it, but it surely is not easy, and goes back to something that was said earlier. Suppose there had been more resistance, suppose the churches had spoken out, which so many of us wish they had. The question is asked again and again, would it have made a difference? I do believe that regardless of the results, we have to speak out, and sometimes it does make a difference, but at least somehow the human spirit, I think, is a need by speaking out.
I'm going to take this opportunity to lean on Ira to get something done, which several years ago, ADL made a wonderful movie called The Garden of the Righteous, which was a story of these people who helped non-Jews who have been commemorated by stones and trees in Jerusalem. And we showed it to our Holocaust class. It was very powerful. When it came time to teach this year, I found out the movie has been withdrawn from circulation. I was unable to get it. It's no longer listed in the ADL calendar. And so I would like you to use your efforts to try and get that back in, because I thought, it is true. These people are talking, they look like, and they were the people next door, and they did not claim in any way, shape, or form to be heroes. It was the right thing to do. It was, for some of them, the Christian thing to do. And it's a very, very moving movie, and I would like to show it to my students.
May I just say that it is listed in the catalogue that we have outside, put out by the International Center for Holocaust Studies. It is listed.
Well, it was withdrawn and it was back in. Wonderful.
Evidence of how quickly we work on requests. The latest published research findings on this subject, which appear in our periodical Dimensions, samples of which were on the literature table, not this particular issue, which just came out a couple of days ago, indicate that 1% of the non-Jewish population of Europe actively worked to save Jewish lives. And as a direct result of their efforts, it is estimated that between 70,000 and 200,000 Jews were saved from the Holocaust.
Yes, sir.
Sir, talk about that the individual can make a difference. I, for one, will say yes. I say I'm a survivor. The reason I'm a survivor and the reason I'm alive today and I'm able to talk to you is because of one lady, which goes back 5 generations from today, that has saved my life and sacrificed. She would have sacrificed her life in those days, because no Jew, if a Jew was ever found in a Christian home, hid, that whole house the people were murdered. Either the house was burned down or destroyed. And I can attest to that with the 4th generation, a young lady in 1981, a 4th generation lady, she was about 28, 5 or 6 years ago, that asked me to bring her to America. And I brought her to America. She since got married. I sponsored her because of her grandparents that did for me and my family. I sponsored her, and she's not Jewish. She's Roman Catholic. She married since, has a child who's the 5th generation, and I got her married. I was the stand-in father, or the surrogate father, and we have a good relation. I'm a father right now to her. So I like to say that one Christian person, one person can make a difference. Otherwise, I can attest to that. I would not be here talking to you people.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Mhm.
I would like to speak on one lesson of Holocaust that came up directly from our studies. We studied children and parents. In all rescuers in our feeling, our paternal and maternal people, and as far as I know from Eva Fleischner, they are good parents. They love their own children. And I only hope that we can learn this lesson in what the gentleman here referred to as the current situation in Israel. I can only hope, and I come back now, before I finish the sentence, to the fact that the Nazis so hated their own children that thousands of them, 10,000, 100,000, were sent to their death, and eventually they, with the exception of Russia, they lost more Germans than the other people. Now that does not happen to the Arabs, our cousins and brothers. Let them not send their 12-year-old to throw stones. Let the grown-ups go and sit at the peace table. And if they learn what the Nazi learned and what the German nation learned, that you don't send your children to fight big armies, then we can all sit down and talk peace.
Any comment to that? Yes, ma'am.
There are always the exceptions during the war. I just want to make a small comment and I'll ask a question. My own life was saved, believe it or not, by a Nazi commander in Germany who practically saved my life, constantly doing the death match. If it would be him, I probably wouldn't live. But my question is, has it been done a research to find out what kind of human being is it that it prompted them, despite all this danger, to hide you? But I would like to know, what is their background, who their parents were, what they themselves, was it their occupation or their thinking? This must be exceptional people, because they were danger in saving people. In one of Mr. Weinberg's studies, well known, who saved thousands of Jews, with passport. Has a study been done, or will it be done? It would be very interesting to know.
I think this is precisely what she is doing now.
My study is a very small drop in the ocean. The major effort that I'm aware of is the study by Professor Samuel Oliner of Humboldt State, together with many other people, one of whom is Eva Fleischner, on the altruistic personality project. And the study has been going on now for several years. He has people working all over Europe and the United States and Israel, I believe. And the book is to be published very shortly. Dr. Kestenberg, do you know just when? Or, I think this spring. Pardon? Yeah, so this, to look for that Samuel Oliner, the altruistic personality project, it is in process of publication. The article by Eva Fleischner in this issue of Dimensions also addresses your question: what in a person's background produces this kind of a person? And Dr. Nehama textbook, When Light Pierces the Darkness, also has some insights into this. But I think Oliner's study is probably the most complete thing we will have very shortly.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is such.
Frank, if I may, this publication of Dimensions, which is the newest issue of this periodical, has on page 11 a reproduction of a poster in German. The top line reads, Verordnungsblatt. And the caption explains, this is a public notice decreeing death for persons who knowingly provide hiding places for Jews. This was not a rumor, this is a fact. Nonetheless, as want to spend a vacation in Germany. And they answer me by saying, we want to go there to thank the people who helped us escape.
May I add one more in response to you? They were extraordinary, they are extraordinary people, they certainly look that way to us, but I'm not sure that all the studies that have been done thus far give us the full answer. You have an Oskar Schindler, who there was absolutely nothing noble about him as far as we know before the war or after the war. In fact, he died, I think, in a flophouse. But for a short time, the man rose to extraordinary heights and saved more than 1,000 Jews, the Schindler Juden. And I don't think Schindler can be explained. He's a typical playboy. But I don't know that ultimately this does not perhaps defy analysis. There is something here, maybe, it is what Jewish tradition means by God created the human being in his own image and likeness. There's something here, perhaps an instinct for goodness that cannot, I believe, be fully explained ultimately. I'm sure there are different views.
It has to be done.
Pardon?
It has to be done.
Yeah, and where does that come from?
But my mother was saved after the sun under the roof till we were able to immigrate. Otherwise, we would have been in the concentration camp. Because they collected all boys and men for about 30 years after the Kristallnacht.
Yes.
I find myself in the position of somewhat of a devil's advocate, or bringing up another corner here. Somehow, or other, I was thinking a few minutes ago, I don't know if you all have read the book, I believe I have the right name, The Moses of Rovno. The Moses of Rovno was a person who was a German and who worked actively in his job, reverse of his job, and he ended up working for the Nazis and saving some Jews. And after the war, as his role was known, his own countrymen didn't care too much for him. It's a very moving book. And I think sometimes we also have to consider and think, and I hope someday there'll be some studies to see why some people, I guess it's really, they just don't want to know the unpleasantness that might apply to them as a group. But I think that is something that we, at least also individually, need to address.
All right. Yes, we'll take one more.
Is it wrong to parallel the plight of Jews in the Soviet Union with when you think about the lessons of the Holocaust and the lessons of the Civil Rights Movement? Is there a place now, is there something more that we can do as American citizens to help the Jews of the Soviet Union? Or should we wait until there's a genocide there, wait until they've done something else to help our brethren in the Soviet Union?
I don't think the analogy holds, because the American Jewish community has been extremely active for a long time. Jews would not have been let go out of the Soviet Union ever since Nixon's time without the pressure of the American Jewish community on the American government. Certainly, the American government had no interest, per se, in sponsoring Jewish immigration. It did so because it responded to political pressure. And in many ways, there you do have the lesson. And that here you have a place where the American Jewish community had the power and used it, within limits. And I think that it's well to note that the response of the American government to this political pressure varied also according to what Nixon, Kissinger, and their successors saw as American interests as well as the political expedient thing to do. And that when it was politically expedient to foster Jewish immigration, they did so, and when it was politically expedient not to make such noise, they did so. The community still is a minute community, but it has rescued, it has sponsored. In fact, it's done quite a bit. Here again, you can say, has it done enough? And that's a question that I don't know if you can answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, in keeping faith with you as regards our time frame, I'm going to call this to closure at this point with appreciation to our panel, and at the same time that I do that, to issue an invitation to you and to look to the future. Here at the university, as a part of the Weinstein-Rosenthal program in Jewish and Christian Studies, we do have a lectureship each fall. The inaugural one was this past fall, but a program which is oriented toward enhancing and supporting Jewish and Christian relationships. One of the things that it seems to me has come out in a lot of different ways throughout this conference is, I don't want to use the wording Christian culpability exactly, but somehow it is there. I can speak from within the house, and I suppose that's all right. But there is within Christendom a lot of concern about the nature and understanding of the biblical text and how that biblical text affects Jewish and Christian relations. You're seeing this in much of the kind of right-wing evangelical Christian side at this point. Addressing part of that on, I believe it's September the 17th, coming up, will be James Sanders from Claremont, who will be addressing the issue of the authority of the biblical text and what that authority mandates and doesn't mandate in terms of our Jewish and Christian relations. I invite you to be a part of that.